We are in, of course, the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel. You enjoying this so far? This morning we're in chapter 19. Yeah, Dave.
You asked if I was enjoying it?
Are you enjoying it?
Well, yes, but I'd like to give a little testimony to your studies, and that is I've prayed recently, and God answered my prayer immediately, actually, and it referred to 2 Samuel. He pointed me right at 2 Samuel.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. It's good when that happens. So we're in chapter 19, beginning at verse 24. And we're going to be looking this morning at a meeting that David has with a lame man by the name of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth was a son of Jonathan, David's special friend, and the grandson of King Saul. But before we look at today's text from 2 Samuel 19, chapter 19, let me give you some, just for lack of a better term, some lead-in or some background. Back when David was on the run, and we've covered this a little while back. Back when David was on the run from King Saul, David and Jonathan, you will recall, met in a field. And they made a covenant. And let me read, if you want to turn there, to 1 Samuel chapter 20, beginning with verse 11. And Jonathan said to David, "Come, let us go out into the field." So both of them went out into the field. This is 1 Samuel chapter 20, beginning at verse 11. And then Jonathan said to David, "The Lord God of Israel is witness. When I have sounded out my father sometime tomorrow or the third day, and indeed there is good toward David, and I do not send to you and tell you, may the Lord do so and much more to Jonathan. But if it pleases my father to do you evil, then I will report it to you and send you away that you may go in safety. And the Lord be with you as he has been with my father." Verse 14, "And you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever, no, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "Let the Lord require it at the hand of David's enemies." Now, this covenant of friendship and protection was to extend to, like we just read, to their offspring. And then later on, we see David's response to this covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 8. We'll look at a few verses in here in 8 and 9. 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 15. "So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered judgment and justice to all his people." And then drop down to a few verses, a couple verses to chapter 9, where under the heading of David's kindness to Mephibosheth. "Now David said, Is there still anyone who is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, or Ziba, however you want to pronounce it. So when they had called him to David, the king said to him, Are you Ziba? And he said, I'm at your service. Then the king said, Is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet. So the king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, indeed he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar. Then King David sent and brought him out of the house of those folks there. And now when Mephibosheth, verse 6, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. Then David said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, here is your servant. So David said to him, do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. Verse 8. Then he bowed himself and said, what is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I? And the king called to Ziba, and he said, Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and to all his house. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king has commanded his servant, so will your servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both feet. So, as we've just read, when David became king of all of Israel, he inherited everything that had belonged to Saul, including his land, and some of the land he turned over to Mephibosheth to help support him and his family. And then David commanded Saul's servant, like we just read, to care for the land and to obey Mephibosheth, which he promised to do. Now, when David was escaping from Absalom, from Jerusalem, Ziba showed up without his master and brought help to David and his people at that time, and David made an impulsive decision and gave all the land to Ziba. Notice chapter 16 of 2 Samuel. When David was a little past the top of the mountain, there was Ziba the servant of Mephibosheth, who met him with a couple of saddled donkeys, and on them 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a skin of wine. And the king said to Ziba, what do you mean to do with these? So he said, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who are faint in the wilderness to drink. Then the king said, where's your master's son? Referring to Mephibosheth. And Ziba said to the king, indeed he is staying in Jerusalem, for he said, today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me. So the king said to Ziba, Here, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours. So that's this impulsive decision, I think, that David makes. And Ziba said, I humbly bow before you that I may find favor in your sight, my lord, my king. Now, as a little side note here, before I go on, Ziba is mentioned again. Well, he's mentioned quite often, but he shows up to help David cross the Jordan River and return home to Jerusalem. That's in the 17th verse of chapter 19. It says, Now Shimei, the son of Jerah, fell down before the king when he had crossed the Jordan. Then he said to the king, Do not let my lord Um, verse 17, I'm sorry, of chapter 19. There were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and Ziba the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons, and his 20 servants with him, and they went over the Jordan before the king. So Ziba had helped David get across the Jordan back over to his home in Jerusalem. So any questions or comments so far? Because that kind of brings us up to speed where we are today. Yeah.
So was Ziba in cahoots with Shimei?
I think so. Now, let me read verse 24, chapter 19. Now Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king, and he had not cared for his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day that he returned in peace. Now, picture this. Picture Mephibosheth. And looking in this kind of shape. And so it's like he has the appearance of that of a mourner. Mourner. Because, and I say that because it says, from the day the king departed until the day he returned in peace. So when David left Jerusalem on the run from Absalom, it's like there was no one around, I guess, maybe to care for him, or maybe he didn't want people to care for him. So he had suspended all efforts to keep himself groomed. You got that? And there's no way of knowing at this point, because the text does not say whether his grief here was genuine or it was fake. We don't know for sure. But what takes place now is King David goes immediately to the heart of that is David's concerns. Notice verse 25. So it was, when he had come to Jerusalem to meet the king, that the king said to him, why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? In other words, why did you stay back there? Why did you not come with me? And Mephibosheth's answer now appears to me to be kind of lame, pun intended. And his servant Ziba had both tricked him and then slandered him to David, according to Mephibosheth. Notice verses 26 and 27. And so Mephibosheth answered, my lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go to the king, because your servant is lame. And he has slandered your servant to my lord the king, but my lord the king is like the angel of God. Therefore, do what is good in your eyes. You see what's happening here? Mephibosheth then recites David's kindness to his father's house. His father is Jonathan. Saul's his grandfather. And puts himself at David's mercy. Notice verse 28. For all my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king. Yet you set your servant among those who eat at your own table. Therefore, what right have I still to cry out any more to the king? And so David listens to Mephibosheth's explanation, and as he does that, he realized that he had jumped to conclusions when he gave all the land to Ziba. But David didn't have time to conduct a hearing to settle the matter. And Mephibosheth made it clear here that he wasn't asking his king for anything. The king had given him life, like he said. He said, For all my father's house were but dead men before the Lord my king. And so what more, and I think in the mind of Mephibosheth, he's thinking, what more was there to desire? And to paraphrase his speech this way, put it down like this: I have more than I deserve, so why should I seek the throne? I was destined to die, and you not only saved me, but also took me into your own family circle. So, as it were, David had kind of adopted Mephibosheth into the family. He was going to take care of him, make sure he was taken care of the rest of his life. He could eat at David's table. He could eat at the king's table. This story gave punch or impetus to the song, I'm feasting at his banquet table. His banner over me is love. That was how the birth of that song came about years ago. Now, let me read verse 29. So the king said to him, why do you speak any more of your matters? I have said, you and Ziba divide the land. Now, David's response here is kind of difficult to understand. On the surface, he seems to be saying, there's no need to go into the matter again. You and Ziba just divide the land. But we might ask, was David the kind of man who went back on his word? Because you see, remember, David had given all the land to Ziba. Remember that? We just read that back in chapter 16, verse 4. So how would this kind of a decision, you have a question, Carol? You got that look on your face.
Well, it had also all been previously given to Mephibosheth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he had already given all of it to both of them. Mm-hmm. And now he's in a he said.
Yeah.
And
yeah. The thing is,
he might have even been being really smart, how Solomon wasn't it Solomon with the two women claiming the baby?
Were you looking over my shoulder when I made notes regarding this thing? No, we're good. That's a good, what do they call it, a segue or lead in or whatever. I think because of David's kindness to Mephibosheth, David fully expected Mephibosheth to show up. Okay? Because Ziba was going to take care of him. He said, you take care of him. So Mephibosheth, even though he was lame, had no excuse for not showing up. But you see, Ziba, in so many words, had told Mephibosheth, stay put. So he did that. And how would the decision, see, the thing that's puzzling about David's decision is, he wasn't a man who would necessarily go back on his word. An oath was an oath. Covenant was a covenant. And how would that kind of a decision be received by the 1,000 Benjamites who came to the Jordan River to welcome David back and help him get across the river? And then after all, doing something kind to Mephibosheth would have strengthened David's ties with both the tribe of Benjamin, which was Saul's tribe, and then also the 10 tribes that had originally followed the house of Saul. So it was kind of, you could look at it as kind of a win-win situation. But, big word here. 3 letters, but a big situation. Taking away half of Mephibosheth's inheritance hardly fit, in my opinion, into the joyful and forgiving atmosphere of that day. And yet, by dividing the estate, listen to this closely now, David was also forgiving Ziba of his lies and treachery to his master. And then by dividing the land between Ziba and Mephibosheth, David was taking kind of the easy way out. That's simply kind of my opinion. But the reply of Mephibosheth must certainly have stunned David at this point. Notice what Mephibosheth says is recorded in verse 30. Then Mephibosheth said to the king, rather let him take it all, inasmuch as my lord the king has come back in peace to his own house. So Mephibosheth is saying, I'm just thankful you're back in peace in Jerusalem.
Just take it for what it is. It shows his alliance to David.
Yeah.
I have a totally unrelated question.
Okay.
But this might be as good a time as any to ask it. Do we have any idea why in the Old Testament in particular there are names like Saul and David and Noah and even Solomon and stuff, Adam, that are really, really easy? And then there is Mephibosheth and all the other tongue twister ones that seem to be intermingled.
You know, it's interesting. But it's interesting, but 2 or 3 of the guys in the program at the mission asked the exact same question this week. Or within the last several days. Because you see, in chapel at night, some of the guys are speaking to the guests. They're the ones who are speaking to the guests. And they read a portion of Scripture and then they comment on it. And some of the guys, one in particular, Mark, came to me the other night and he says, I need to ask you this question. He asked the same question. He says there's names like Adam and Saul and Jesus, but he said, how do you pronounce this name? And it was from, I forget what book it was from, but it was a rather long name, and so I explained it to him. We sat down and kind of wrote it. He wrote it out phonetically so he could make sure. And I told him, I said, sometimes when I'm sharing, I just get to a big word like that or a city or whatever, and I'll say big word or big city, big name city, stuff like that. So I don't know. I mean, it's just the names that you wonder sometimes where they came up with these names, what baby book they were looking at or anything like that when they named their kid. So now, let's don't forget to be reminded of the fact that because of David's impetuous judgment, as recorded back there in chapter 16, verse 4, Ziba already had all the land. You got that? And so Mephibosheth's reply here was kind of a moot, could be classified as a moot point at this point. But I don't look at it as entirely a moot point because I think it was just David's kind of easy way out. And see, David was concerned now about uniting the forces, uniting the country. And I don't think he wanted to mess that much with a lot of this stuff. And so he said that. He said, divide the land. Now, I wrote here, this situation reminds me of a little bit of the case of the dead baby that Solomon had to solve. 1 Kings chapter 3 records that story, and a lot of us here are familiar with that. When Solomon offered to divide or cut in two pieces the living baby, the child's true mother protested, and that's how Solomon, and we'll get to that when we get to studying 1 Kings, that's how Solomon discovered the true identity of the mother. So in this situation, unlike a living baby, the land here isn't harmed when it's divided. Or rarely is land harmed when it becomes divided. And perhaps, and this is just conjecture on my part, perhaps David was testing Mephibosheth to see where his heart was, to see where his loyalty was. And the text doesn't tell us, but perhaps, and again, this is conjecture on my part, perhaps Mephibosheth did receive all the land. We don't know. Text doesn't say. Either way, and here's the bottom line. Either way, lame Mephibosheth was cared for because Ziba worked the land. Ziba and his servants had worked the land. So Mephibosheth was taken care of. He not only had his land worked, the land that he had that was originally given to him, but he continued to eat at the king's table and enjoy being kind of an adopted son of the king. Ruthie.
Were they still under the rules of the years of Jubilee and returning the land to the original owners?
I don't know whether it probably did, because that was already laid down. That rule of Jubilee was in place, so it could have been very well. That it wound up back in under the custody of Mephibosheth. Well, that's all I got with this morning. But the thing is, the bottom line, like I just said, Mephibosheth was cared for, and the land was worked. The land was taken care of. Any questions or comments?
Wasn't Ziba and his sons told that they were to take care of the land?
Yeah.
All of it?
Yeah, that's what we mentioned when we were kind of given some background. Where they said, David said, is there anybody still around of Saul's house that I can show kindness to? And there was still Mephibosheth, and he was lame, and then that's when David said to Ziba, you're going to take care of him. You're going to take care of him. So, yeah.
Assuming that the land did go back to Ziba, after
You mean
the
Mephibosheth?
grandson said this. Well, no, if he said, here, let him have all
yeah,
of it.
yeah.
So then it would be Ziba's, and his family would work it, and even though Mephibosheth, I think that's right, still was cared for at the king's table, my understanding is that back in that time, that inheritances were huge, hugely important.
Yeah.
So wouldn't that have been like him giving up something of value if he was giving up his inheritance,
You mean
if you will?
Mephibosheth?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
He was given all of Saul's holdings. That
Yeah.
should have been huge.
Yeah. Yeah. And see, and the way the king stuff works, when a succeeding king came in, then they had possession of everything, not only the stuff that they had, but what the previous king had. So David, I mean, gosh, think of all of the stuff that he had. And then you think of all of that stuff that had been accumulated, and then Solomon comes on the scene. And then other kings that came in. And we see there were kings, as we get into the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, especially 1st Kings, we'll see how the kings rise up, and some of them took advantage of the gain that they'd acquired, where others were very frugal and very benevolent. And so we'll see that when we get to that. So next week, and go ahead and read ahead the next few verses. Next week, David's attempt to reward an old man. That's what we're going to talk about next week. David's attempt to reward an old man. Okay?